Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, how's it going?
Great.
Thanks for being
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I've heard so many great things about you, and I've heard you on a bunch of my friends' podcasts, so I couldn't wait to chat with you in person.
Yeah, this is great.
So let's just dive right in. I love your approach. Muscle-centric medicine.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Well, it's the concept that muscle is the largest organ in the body. It's actually not just for locomotion. It's an endocrine organ. It determines everything about the way that we age.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so, okay, before...
And it's the most underappreciated organ. So there's a cardiologist that deals with the heart. There are individuals, endocrinologists that deal with the thyroid. But what about muscle?
Yeah.
Muscle as an endocrine organ, when it contracts, it releases things like called myokines.
Wow.
And myokines travel throughout the body that protect the bone and the brain. And they help with nutrition partitioning, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
That's amazing. Yeah, most people think about muscle in just one context.
Right.
Like it's aesthetic value.
Right. And that's probably the least important.
Wow.
So it's very important for aesthetics, right? Everyone wants to look good in a bikini or mankini, whatever you...
Mankini.
Right, of course.
Yeah, a sunga. I like Brazilian sungas.
Yeah. So, well, there's that. And the other aspect is that it's our metabolic currency. So it determines everything about our body composition. Why that's so important is for diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. It all starts in the muscle first.
How did you come to this realization?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't fun. I did training with Dr. Donald Lehman, who is one of the world-leading protein experts. Then I went to medical school. And then after medical school, I did 2 years of training in psychiatry and then 3 years of family medicine. And I was like, well, okay, this is great, but I need more education. So I went and I did a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis in obesity medicine. And part of the deal with obesity medicine and nutrition is I had to do a fellowship in geriatrics. Okay, so geriatrics, as you know, is really later life, aging. Well, part of my responsibilities was running a memory clinic. And the other part was running an obesity clinic and doing studies. And there was one woman in particular. All physicians have their favorite patient. She was an incredible human being. She was in her late 40s and she had 3 kids. She had been obese her entire life and been chasing this body fat issue. This, I have to lose body fat. I have to lose weight. We imaged her brain and I saw flattening of her brain matter. And we knew within 20 years, she was going to have some serious cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's. You know, whether it was Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment, but I realized at that moment that everyone is focusing on the wrong tissue, that we are looking at the pathological problem. You know, we're looking at pathology. We're looking at adipose tissue. Most people regain the weight, but the reality is the solution is muscle. And muscle is the most underappreciated organ. And by shifting the paradigm from the failure of the fat-focused paradigm to a muscle-centric approach, we can change the trajectory of aging. And that's where muscle-centric medicine was born.
I love that. So rather than obsess over the amount of fat that we may or may not be carrying, right? You're saying, look, that's putting the cart before the horse.
Totally. Insulin resistance is a problem everybody talks about. That is a primary deficit in the skeletal muscle first. Insulin resistance starts in the skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. However, everybody is talking about fat tissue. That comes later. Muscle tissue is like a suitcase. If you overfill it, things spill back into the bloodstream. Then you store it as fat, not first. So by optimizing muscle tissue through resistance exercise, through really understanding the importance of dietary protein, high quality dietary protein, you can take care of this tissue that declines with aging, that becomes more insulin resistant, that becomes more anabolically resistant. By understanding that this is the mechanism of health, you can protect your family members.
That's amazing. So in the practical sense, if you're looking in the mirror and you are overweight, perhaps you've got some some observable traits of like metabolic syndrome. Maybe, your waist is, larger than it should be. You're saying don't worry about the weight loss. Focus on putting on as much muscle as you can for your frame and for your genetics.
Totally. You have to correct metabolic composition first. By correcting and making sure that you have healthy muscle tissue, the weight will come off. But by focusing on the weight loss, the quick fix, the fasting even, it's not about the amount of weight that you lose, it's about the quality. So every time you lose weight, for the most part, you lose partially muscle tissue and partially fat tissue. But if you do it strategically, the majority of the weight can just be fat. But it really takes some time and effort. And that is so valuable when we think about the recidivism, the regain weight.
You mentioned myokines.
Yeah.
What are those?
Myokines are, they're actually cytokines. So they're proteins that are particularly secreted by the muscle tissue when it contracts. For example, the most famous myokine is interleukin 6. And people are going to say, but interleukin 6, that's part of the cytokine system, that's part of the immune system. Well, yes, but muscle, when you contract muscle tissue, the myokine, for example, interleukin 6, is anti-inflammatory. So your skeletal muscle system actually works in conjunction with your immune system. And it has a counter-regulatory effect. Also, interleukin 6 allows for nutrient partitioning. So you'll utilize more fat tissue. You'll utilize more fatty acids. You'll utilize more glucose. So, oftentimes when we think about exercise, we just think about that contractile health or the mitochondrial health. But when you really shift your focus to think about muscle as an endocrine organ and what it secretes, it totally changes the importance and the perspective.
That's amazing. BDNF is also released by muscle tissue.
And that's considered another myokine.
What is BDNF for listeners who are hearing?
So it's brain-derived neurotropic factor, and it helps with memory. And we know the studies are really clear that the more you exercise, the better your memory, the better your cognition. And I know that's particularly of interest to you and important for you and what you value.
Huge.
Yeah.
So we have a lot to gain by gaining more.
We have everything to lose if we don't.
And we have everything to lose if we don't.
Yeah.
It becomes increasingly difficult to grow and maintain muscle mass as we get older, right? It does.
And part of this is due to something called anabolic resistance.
Anabolic resistance. It's the first time I'm hearing that.
Yeah, interesting. So the concept of anabolic resistance is there's a decrease in nutrient sensing in the body, in particular the muscle. So individuals require more dietary protein at one time to overcome this anabolic resistance, which is essentially an inefficiency of utilizing protein. And that's oftentimes why we see individuals who eat the way that they did when they were 20, continue to eat the same kind of macronutrients, get skinny fat because they never adapt and adopt to their changing hormonal milieu, which is testosterone decreases, IGF-1 decreases, which we're going to talk about. All these hormones decrease. And if you don't overcompensate for dietary protein, then your muscles don't even stand a chance. So for listeners, what does that mean? What is a take-home message? Well, we know that if you have a robust amount of protein, and really when I say robust, that's between 30 and 50 grams per meal, you can overcome that anabolic resistance. And in particular, it's the high-quality protein because it has the most abundant amino acids. And I know that we're going to talk about mTOR for the listeners. I don't want to give too much away.
I hope so.
The high-quality protein has higher amounts of the branch chains, in particular leucine. And leucine is what triggers muscle protein synthesis. And interestingly, it triggers it through mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is very controversial for people because they say, well, when you stimulate mTOR, you have a growth factor that may contribute to cancer. Okay, so should we unpack that now?
Let's break this apart.
Okay.
Well, actually, before we get there, so we're talking about leucine, right? If you have because I know that you're an expert in protein, and this is, part of your background is to really look into, protein quality as well. If you have, say, 30 grams worth of protein in the form of chicken breast, and you've got 30 grams worth of protein in the form of peanut butter, or,
How about, let me give you an example.
Give me an example.
Okay. So 30 grams of protein in a chicken breast is about 4 ounces. That's a little. To equate that to, say, a plant-based protein, it would be about 6 cups of quinoa.
6 cups of quinoa.
Yeah.
To get to get the amino acid equivalent of 4 ounces of chicken breast.
So that is metabolically devastating. If we talk about carbohydrates, we can really talk about what that means and the best amount of carbohydrates. But really, when you think about carbohydrates, it has to be dosed in a meal threshold, right? Because you want to maintain insulin levels. You don't want to have a very robust insulin response, but you have to protect your tissue. So the difference between animal-based proteins and, quality versus plant is you have to consume maybe 35% more. And it has so many more carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So it's just not doable. So this becomes very dangerous with this current narrative. Everybody's talking about going more plant-based. But the data, the NHANES data, which is the largest data set, would suggest we're already plant-based.
Yeah. I mean, 60% of the calories that we consume come from ultra-processed foods, which are low-protein foods.
Right. So we're already plant-based. The argument could be we need better plants. But as it relates to protein, we can't confuse a plant-based diet with a high-quality protein diet. You just cannot.
Are there differences in the protein quality itself?
Oh, yeah.
There's I forget the acronym, but it's like the DIA. Yeah.
Sorry, just making a mess in your head.
It's all good.
It's all right. So when you think about protein quality, you think about the DIAs. So these are digestibility amino acid scores. And these are hard, fast biological numbers. And it's really based on the quality of the amino acids and the digestibility of the amino acids. And, when you really, a good practical way to think about that is animal-based proteins, including eggs or whey, those kinds of things, have a higher amino acid score. They are higher in the bioavailability. Whereas plant, and there's some researchers out there that would say soy and wheat are just the same. But that's really tortured data, and you really cannot change the biological value of amino acids. And I think, people have to be very aware and particular about where they get their information and really just thinking critically about it, right? So you can look at a steak, that steak is not the same quality as a broccoli.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just know, and there was this channel that I grew up watching that actually had surgeries on it. I think it was Discovery Health when that existed. Yeah. And I've seen enough of those to know that we are red meat. When you open us up, we're like
exactly.
beef. You open up a cow and you open up a human being, they look pretty similar.
Right.
And so to me, intuitively, logically, it just stands to reason that when you eat something like that, you're going to get to create more of what makes you healthy and robust.
And actually, you bring up a great point, because the quality of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue that we eat is very similar to our own tissue. And it provides the correct amino acid profile, in particular, those branch chains, those leucine, isoleucine, and valine that we need in the correct amounts. And that's where it becomes so important to understand that it's not just eat high quality protein. It's eat the correct amount of protein in a 24-hour period, which is arguably well above double the RDA. So the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. 1.6 grams per kilogram is probably still on the lower end.
Wow.
In my clinical practice, I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, because protein isn't just about muscle. It also helps with appetite regulation. And we know body composition is the ultimate. But we don't really eat for protein. We eat for those amino acids. And there's 20 different amino acids, and they do all kinds of different things. And that's what we need. So you have to understand that it's a 24-hour period. And then you have to break it down to bolus feeding meals. And that's so important, especially as we're aging, and especially when we think about sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and function, and when we think about anabolic resistance. So these things are the cornerstone, and they're missing in the conversation because we have a failure of this fat-focused paradigm.
Resistance training, I'm sure, is a big part of your
Huge.
prescription for
Yeah.
health, right? Would your recommendations, this 30 to 50 gram of protein per meal recommendation, change for somebody who maybe is not yet on an intense resistance training regimen?
I love this question. When you resist, so the simple answer is no, because you still require that amino acid bolus to stimulate muscle protein synthesis.
Can you stimulate muscle protein synthesis without without resistance training?
So you can stimulate it two ways, really, arguably. You can stimulate it through dietary protein and resistance exercise.
So you can literally change your body composition just purely by eating more protein.
You can. You do have to control for calories, but you absolutely can, and I've seen it happen.
Wow.
Arguably, resistance exercise is even more important than diet when it comes to the literature, which I actually didn't want to believe. But it really is important to, challenge the muscle and stimulate it. You can't get away from that.
Right.
Especially as you think about maintaining overall health.
That's so interesting. So, there have been a number of studies that have shown that, people that as they get older, especially the above 65 set, increased longevity, reduced risk of cancer when they consume more protein. But there's been a number of studies that have shown the opposite for people who are younger. Can you help us make sense of all that?
So let's just take a step back and think about what is meaningful when we think of statistics and when we think of scientific studies. So a lot of the information, the studies that have come out are epidemiological studies. So they're not randomized controlled trials. They're what we would consider low quality data. And when you think about epidemiological studies, you think about relative risk or risk ratio. And in order for something to be clinically significant, it has to be above 2. Let me give you an example. Smoking and cancer, it has a relative risk of 12. They looked at all the study and all the literature of cancer and protein. Guess what the relative risk was?
Probably a fraction.
1.1.
Wow.
So the question becomes, at what point do we find something relevant?
1.1 meaning a 10% increased relative?
So in order for it to be clinically significant, the relative risk has to be above 2.
Got it.
1.1 is clinically insignificant.
Got it. So it's basically meaningless.
Correct. However, if you torture the data enough, you'll get the information you want. For example, the IARC committee. So everyone will say meat is a carcinogen. So the IARC committee came out with this position saying that red meat is a carcinogen or processed meat. The Annals of Internal Medicine, first of all, reviewed all of this. Annals of Internal Medicine is like the Super Bowl of literature. I mean, it's one of the most highly respected journals.
Huge impact factor.
Exactly. They found no increased risk. The committee that actually talked about protein and cancer risk turned out to be largely vegetarian. And they had a very strict criteria where they threw out all the high quality data. They limited a large amount of the randomized controlled trials and used low quality epidemiological data. It seems to me that there is a massive agenda problem.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Right? But the issue is that prevents people from understanding health.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And you asked about IGF-1.
Yeah, so I do want to know about.
Yeah.
I do want to know.
Yeah. So if IGF-1 was really a problem and higher levels of IGF-1 was an issue.
Well, what is IGF-1?
IGF-1 is insulin-like growth factor.
Okay.
Then everyone in their 30s, when IGF-1 is their highest, arguably, or maybe late 20s, would have cancer. But you never see that. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And then there's this conversation about mTOR and cancer. Let's take a step back. So mTOR is mechanistic target of rapamycin. And people say that it's one of the pathways for growth promotion, which it is. Did you know that there's mTOR in every single tissue?
Yeah, that it's not just like this. It's like your mTOR isn't this like singular dial that controls growth in the. But yeah, it's like expressed in different tissues at different times.
Exactly. And what if I told you it's sensitive to different macronutrients as well? Skeletal muscle is exquisitely sensitive to dietary protein. Mechanistic target of rapamycin, mTOR, is what helps and promotes muscle protein synthesis.
Right.
Through via leucine, which we talked about earlier. But mTOR is also stimulated by other things, like excess calories and excess insulin, which the liver and the pancreas are much more sensitive to. So if you're really concerned about mTOR and cancer, the worst thing that you could do is eat a high carbohydrate diet with excess calories. But it arguably has nothing to do with protein and amino acids. That's like saying exercise is bad for you because stimulating muscle is bad for you.
Well, also you want mTOR to be stimulated in muscle.
Of course you do.
Right. And you mentioned also that protein has this hunger satiating effect.
It does.
More so than carbs, more so than fat.
Right.
And so if protein is a tool that keeps you in a eucaloric sort of balance, right? Then that's amazing.
Exactly. So really what we're looking at is an anti-animal narrative where people that are just truly against eating animals, and it's very emotional for them. So they go to an environmental conversation, they go to a cancer conversation. And by the way, if you just think about the conversation, what kind of cancer are we even talking about?
Right.
Right? Are we talking about lung cancer, which hasn't changed in the last 40 years? Are we talking about other forms of cancer, endometrial cancer, uterine cancer? Cancers are really related to obesity. That is a risk factor. That is a known risk factor. Being obese is oncogenic. So where does protein and cancer come in if someone were to really think critically about what is this narrative?
Well, what about, getting specific with the cancers, isn't there a more sort of, isn't there a stronger connection between protein and like colon cancer, for example, or meat and breast cancer?
No, you have to look at the relative risk. If the relative risk is less than 2, then all of these things are low quality epidemiological data. Arguably, the best thing you can do for any of these things is to have an optimal body composition. Keep inflammation low, stay strong. High quality muscle mass is, directly related to your survivability. The lower your skeletal muscle mass, the higher your morbidity and mortality.
I've got a lot of female listeners that might be hearing what you're saying, and the way that might be interpreted is to get more bulky, more muscular.
It's impossible. How long have you been training?
My whole life.
Exactly. How easy.
And look at me.
No. But I mean, how easy. The most that, really, and this is what I was talking to Dr. Don Lehman about this, and the most we've ever seen someone put on muscle without any kind of anabolic agents is you're looking at 2 pounds a month with an untrained individual. The more trained you are, you know how hard it is to put on skeletal muscle?
It's hard.
It is impossible. Have you ever met a girl say, I just am not going to, I'm afraid I'm going to get bulky. I'm going to really train hard, but I'm afraid I'm going to get bulky. In the history of never, I've never seen that. I've seen thousands of patients. No one has ever said, well, I'm getting too bulky.
I think you have like these fit influencers on Instagram now that, many females who probably are taking other kinds of substances. Right. And so, but that's not how your average female is going to look once they start resistance training.
No, you're going to look better. You're going to have tighter skin. You're going to likely be smaller. You're going to have better body composition. You're going to improve your inflammatory markers. You're going to improve your glucose control because you have more skeletal muscle. Muscle is your metabolic currency. It is the largest site for glucose disposal. When you think about your resting metabolic rate, muscle is it. Muscle is incredibly underappreciated. And especially as you transition to perimenopause, menopause, the more muscle you can put on in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, the better you're going to be because it becomes more difficult.
Isn't bone mineral density something that many women struggle with?
Totally.
How does that relate to muscle mass and protein consumption?
And we actually looked at this a lot at WashU. The higher the protein intake, the better the bone density.
Wow.
Because bone is made of protein.
Isn't there what's one of the misconceptions that's often waged against high protein diets that it can...
Bad for the kidneys, number one, which actually that has been massively disproven. There's multiple meta-analysis, so a group of really high-quality papers that have come out. It actually improves kidney function. It improves glomerular filtration rate.
Are these in people with healthy kidneys?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Do you know of any kidney pathological, kidney indications that would, maybe preempt somebody from adopting a high-protein diet or?
I'm definitely not a nephrologist, so I would ask those guys. But if you are healthy, they've never seen an individual consume too much protein.
What I found, there's actually a dearth of nephrologists that specialize in nutrition as well.
Amazing.
If anybody listening to this knows a nephrologist who specializes in nutrition, please hit me up, because that's an area that I'd love to explore further.
You know, when you think about kidneys, you think about diabetes, because there's, you know, the individuals that really go on dialysis are oftentimes diabetics with now kidney issues. Mm-hmm. It's a glucose problem.
And then so bone mineral density.
Yeah, that is another huge myth. Everybody thinks that the more protein you eat, it's bad for your bones. That is totally false. And again, we looked at some of this at WashU, that the higher the protein intake with resistance training, the better the bone density.
Amazing.
And you know, you have to think about your parents. Oftentimes it's been missed. You know, the resistance training piece is really missed. People talk a lot about yoga, talk a lot about Pilates, and then there's meatheads who, you know, I love. My husband's a total meathead. But there's a whole spectrum of training. And, you know, it's really important to do resistance training, and it doesn't have to be heavy. And I cringe when I say that, but the data supports that as long as you have enough volume going to failure. And this is, you know, out of Stu Phillips' lab in Canada. We won't hold that against him. I love Stu. But you have to get that resistance training done. There's no way around it. It's kind of like you might do something for your heart. You have to do something for this tissue, this contractile tissue.
Yeah, I think a lot of women who go to their doctors, maybe they see that they need to up their bone mineral density. They'll start taking a calcium supplement.
Yeah,
which is there. Correct me if I'm wrong. Haven't there been a number of studies that have shown that that taking calcium supplementally actually can increase risk for heart disease?
So there is some evidence about that. I do recommend calcium in my practice. I recommend calcium, vitamin D, K2, and also in certain amounts. You can't just take a whole bolus of calcium all at once. That's not what is recommended. And right now, a lot of us are not getting enough calcium, and that is true. So there are times in which I do recommend that in a responsible way. That's really important.
Yeah. Man, protein. Yeah. It's, so what then, there's like this dogma in the nutrition space to just, all things in moderation, everything's about balance. So walk me through like a day of eating for you. Like what is a balanced, and I'm using air quotes, balanced meal look like for you? So
I don't know if I believe in the balance, and I'm just being truthful. I think that the number one thing that you have to do is you have to determine your ideal body weight. Mm-hmm. I'm 125 pounds. I'll keep that as an ideal body weight. I'll have 125 grams of protein. What's your ideal body weight?
Probably like around what I am now, give or take a few pounds, but I usually hang out at around 185 pounds.
Okay. So that's how much protein I would recommend that you have. And that would be how you build a baseline nutrition plan. Mm-hmm. After that, I think about, do you like carbohydrates or do you like fat? I personally don't eat many carbohydrates. And if you think about it, for every 100 grams of protein you eat, you generate 60 grams of carbohydrates.
For every 100 grams of protein you eat, you generate 60%?
Yeah.
Wow.
So an individual could do a largely, protein-based diet and generate all the glucose they need through gluconeogenesis. So for me, when I think about building my nutrition plan, I think about the high-quality protein. And then I think, do I want carbohydrates or do I want fat? The current recommendation is 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. That's a lot, especially if you have any kind of metabolic impairment. That's too much. You have to then think about carbohydrates in a meal-to-meal basis. And I'm really glad that you asked me this. If you want to optimize body composition, carbohydrates need to be at 40 grams or less per meal. I don't care how you get it. It's 40 grams or less per meal.
You haven't mentioned the word ketosis once.
No.
You're not, that's not the goal.
No, it's not for me, because while a ketogenic style diet may be good for certain things, whether there's certain kinds of cancer, but it might be muscle sparing, but it's not muscle promoting. There are decades of literature to support optimal protein diet to protect muscle tissue and grow muscle tissue. That is my number one priority. So individuals that do a ketogenic diet, I can understand that they're dealing with, wanting to mitigate risk factors, or maybe they're obese, but arguably, why not do an optimal protein diet? Truly. I mean, try it. I have implemented into thousands of patients' nutrition plan. And I've seen, some detrimental effects with a ketogenic style diet. I've seen it change hormones. I've seen it increase reverse T3. I've seen it much less effective in women. And I couldn't tell you why. That's just my clinical experience. And I know there's physicians out there and people that would argue differently. But again, you have to experiment with yourself. I come from a muscle-centric view. And I think that when we focus on muscle tissue as the organ of longevity, as our number one priority, then we're talking about real root cause medicine. Fat tissue comes later. That's focused again on pathology. If we focus on pathology, we're chasing our tail. Because that's the example in medicine. In medicine, they always focus on pathology. But solution-based eating is really muscle-centric. So anyway, you asked me about carbohydrates. So you actually asked me about my nutrition.
Yeah.
40 grams or less, because that diminishes the insulin response. And then fat intake is as desired. Simple.
Got it. So
4 times a day.
Okay. So how many meals a day are you eating?
3 to 4.
3 to 4?
Anywhere between 30 to 50 grams of protein. It's okay if I overshoot protein because protein is very difficult to store as fat. There's never been any negative studies. I mean, they've gone up to 3.3 grams per kilogram easily.
Wow.
And we've never seen any detrimental effects. Improves satiation. It improves body turnover, right? So we're replacing 300 grams a day. Everyone focus on gut health. One of the amino acids, threonine, is so important for mucin production, for gut health. Our immune cells utilize these amino acids for health. It's so under-discussed and so important.
So like, what is a plate? Give me like your breakfast plate and your dinner plate. Like, what do those look like?
Eggs. Breakfast is eggs. We have a little infant, so it's whatever is easy. Maybe 5 eggs, whole eggs, heritage eggs, blue.
I like that.
They're amazing.
Blue shells?
Yeah,
wow.
blue and brown shells.
Oh
Delicious.
my God.
I know.
So wait, you're not also thinking like, got to get my fiber? Like, what do you?
No, I don't actually.
You don't? Interesting.
And I'm not sure what I think about this whole fiber situation. I think it really depends on the gut microbiome. But the scientists would argue with me and say, but you know what? There's good data out there that fiber clearly supports good gut health and biodiversity. That may be true, but I can tell you from my clinical experience in NF1, which is not quite important, that I don't need it. And I have a ton of patients that do well without it.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel, I love to go in on the eggs first thing in the morning, but I just, I feel like it's not, intuitively, I just feel like for me, it's not complete without some kind of like, either I'll like slice up a tomato or like eat an avocado or, something like additional. But yeah, I mean, I get that fiber, there is this sort of blanket recommendation that people should just like eat more fiber. Right. But that's not going to work for every person.
It doesn't.
In fact, the minute if you abruptly try to increase your fiber dramatically, you're going to have all kinds of like digestive, inconveniences. That
was a very polite way of saying that.
Digestive inconveniences.
Yeah.
We've all had them, right?
But I think you bring up a really good point in that what we're seeing now is nutrition is so much more about things that perhaps we don't have our finger on the pulse of, For example, I know some vegan and vegetarian patients that thrive. And my vegan patients have almost they have very little protein. I think to myself, why is that? So there is a component of biodiversity that seems to defy certain things. I mean, arguably they're going to be smaller, they're going to have less muscle mass, their bone density is going to be worse. There's all these other things, but there are going to be some studies coming out that the gut microbiome does break down to provide amino acids. It hasn't been out yet, but I do know that it is being worked on, and I do know that it will come out. So it'll just be something interesting to look at.
It's very interesting. But you're not a carnivore, right?
No, but I would say I'm much closer to, if I were to define myself, to a carnivore style diet. I'll have an avocado. I don't think carnivores eat avocado.
Well, if you're regularly engaging in super intense, HIIT training or resistance training, is there a benefit to titrating up carbohydrates or?
Yeah. Well, number one, it really depends on the individual. So my husband was in the military for a really long time. Those guys that are going on long deployments, they're definitely not doing any kind of caloric restriction or carbohydrate restriction. They're carrying really heavy packs. So those guys, you think for every hour of more intense exercise over 120 beats per minute, you can generate the need for the body between 30 and 70 grams of carbohydrates per hour, depending on what you're doing. I also have a lot of athletes that do not require carbohydrates, that do very well in a more protein adapted plate. Just as we were talking before, that for every 100 grams of protein that you ingest, you generate 60 grams of carbohydrates. So through gluconeogenesis, it's your body generating the carbohydrates. You don't actually have to ingest it. So it really depends on the athletic performance. It depends on the athlete. So it's not necessary.
Yeah. I'll just throw my own anecdote into the mix.
He was doing clubs before we got here.
I was, yeah. I actually don't know what I'm doing with the clubs, but I have some. But I've been boxing lately. I've been taking private boxing lessons, which is a very, very intense workout. And there's a number of confounding variables. Some days I do it in LA and it's just super hot out. Some days it's not as hot out. But what I've noticed is that if I do it fasted in the morning, and I actually typically love to have fasted workouts, but with boxing in particular, because it's such a specific kind of exercise, high intensity anaerobic exercise, I find that if I do it fasted, I just bonk a lot quicker than on days when I eat like a banana beforehand. And I don't typically, this is sort of like a new thing for me because I never in the past felt the need for carbohydrates before a workout. So I don't know. I'm just sort of like experimenting and seeing what works best. Cause some days it just gets really hot and there's like, as I mentioned, there's all these different variables, but yeah, sometimes I find like I do perform better, more effortlessly when I have some of that carbohydrate to go around.
And you wouldn't be alone in saying that. I would also be interested to see how you did on creatine, 5 grams of creatine. Yeah. As well as perhaps, electrolytes throughout the workout and branched chain amino acids. It would just be interesting to see how you do and if there's any anecdotal improvement.
Yeah. BCAAs, talk to me about those because those are, people, you see them all the time in the fitness community. How do those compare to just eating whole protein?
Well, and Bob Wolf came out with a great paper on this particular thing. And it was pretty controversial. And he's in Galveston, Texas. So here's what I think about branched chain amino acids. There's a place for them, but there's 20 amino acids. In order to have muscle protein synthesis, which is really what everyone is looking for when they're thinking about branched chain, is you need the whole spectrum. So what would happen if you took BCAAs on an empty stomach for your muscle, for muscle protein synthesis? Nothing. It would be like turning a key to a car and trying to start the car without any gas. But here's where it actually is exceptional. For your listeners who are vegetarian or vegan or who say, you know what, I don't really want to eat a higher protein diet, you put in a scoop of branched chain amino acids, and then this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, you increase that leucine amount. Now you're talking about augmenting the proper meal. That is where they're exceptional. So branched chain amino acids in, say, for example, if you're having 2 or 3 ounces of fish, or maybe you're having your 5 cups of quinoa, you throw that branched chain amino acid in and your muscle views it as a protein bolus and you have the rest of the amino acids to help.
Wait, what? Fish, though, is a great protein source, no?
Yeah. So fish has about 5 grams of protein per 1 ounce. So you would need 6 ounces of salmon. You're a bigger dude, that would be no problem. I could never eat that much.
Interesting.
I could maybe eat 4 ounces, which would give me 20 grams of protein. But if I told you the most important thing that you can do is protect muscle at all costs, and as we age, the tissue becomes more anabolically resistant, then the thing that I have to do to protect my tissue is to make sure I'm getting 2.5 grams of leucine per meal.
This is so surprising. So fish has a lower protein density
it does.
Than chicken and beef? Wow.
Very and because it's not gravity bearing. So again, you pointed out so astutely that like fuels like. I mean, unless you're scaly and slimy, which I don't know anyone who is.
No, I know some people that are.
But so it actually has a different protein density.
Wow, because they're not gravity. So
Exactly. It's not a gravity bearing. But then someone would say, well, what about an egg? Well, but an egg is kind of the precursor to the chicken. But if it swims, it just has a lower protein density.
fish are just not swole.
They're not. No,
They're not.
No, that would be weird.
Wow. That's super interesting. What about carbohydrates? Going back to the low carbohydrate recommendation and like thyroid function and things like that.
Clinically, I have seen, so now we're talking about, I think, more of a calorie issue.
Got it.
So
interesting.
In an individual who is really restricting calories, I think it's less of a carbohydrate issue and more just about total calorie restriction. And you could easily see that in labs. I actually do believe that low carb is fantastic. But again, a guy like you or a guy like my husband, he is not going to do well on the low carb, right? Fit, healthy.
Yeah.
And I mean, he's super active. His idea of running for fun is going for a 14-mile jog or whatever he does.
Yeah, I do well on low carb, just to be clear. But with specific kinds of exercise, I find it better to carb load. There's probably also value in backloading.
There is. So I would say that's when I use carbohydrates the most is later on in the day.
Interesting.
The first meal of the day is most important. I don't care when you have it. If you have it at noon, that's fine. But this sets up you for metabolic flexibility. It is, you get that first meal right. You're not chasing blood sugar. You're not chasing insulin. You're not chasing, a drop in blood sugar and then your heart's racing because you're having to generate glucose and cortisol. So I would say that the first meal of the day, you keep low carbohydrate and that you place your carbs if you're going to have them around exercise, or simply you backload your carbohydrates to the meal before bed. I have seen that really help with deep sleep.
Wow, interesting.
So these are just practical tips for people to really understand. But I'm telling you, if they take away nothing else, they have to understand that protein matters in a 24-hour period in a proper distribution. So really, it could be 4 to 5 hours. That's really when you're thinking about that mTOR, that reset. Mm-hmm. And then getting protein in the right amounts. So there's a lot of talk about the ketogenic space and the low carb space, but nobody's talking about dosing protein correctly. And it's no wonder that we have all these subsequent health effects, even if someone is low carb, because no one's addressed muscle tissue.
So every 3 to 4 hours,
4 to 5.
Every 4 to 5 hours.
I would say 4 to 5 hours because it allows that. It allows for that mechanism in the muscle cell to reset, which is really important because when I think about feeding, I think about two things. Are you eating to remove hunger? So that's one thing, so I'm just going to have a snack that's maybe under 250 calories, or am I eating for a metabolic purpose? And when you're eating for a metabolic purpose, the concept is really spreading those meals so that you're getting that full anabolic response.
I love that. 1 gram of protein per pound of goal body weight.
Yep. Ideal body weight.
Yeah. What are your views on protein shakes? And then second part of that question, what's your view on collagen?
Great question. Protein shakes can be very valuable. They have to be drank. They have to be taken at one time.
At one time.
So you cannot sip it, because if you sip it, you are then sub-threshold of that amino acid content. And this is the number one thing that I see people do. They'll say, I'm going to have this protein shake, and they'll sip it over an hour.
I don't understand. So you're saying if you're going to do a protein shake, you've got to slam it? You can't drink it really?
Eat it within a half an hour, the whole thing.
Interesting.
Drink it. Don't eat it. That would be weird. Unless you're microwaving it, or I don't know.
You can make like an ice cream with protein shake. Yeah.
Maybe. But one time.
Interesting.
As you push that out, remember the goal for muscle health is to get the bolus amount of amino acids in the bloodstream at once. Anything below that, you're just getting calories. And yeah, the amino acids do other things. They help with vasodilation and they do all that stuff. But the body cares about maintaining muscle tissue and just tissue turnover. So if you don't get enough protein, then the body is just going to go for short-term survival. So that's what I think about protein shakes. And
like types of protein that you prefer, like is it whey?
So I like whey.
Egg. Okay.
I think whey is great because if you're going to have egg, just eat the egg. Whey has a great amino acid profile. I do utilize the rice pea blend for people that are sensitive, but I'm not a super fan because we don't know what those long-term effects are. is with pea, right? We have no idea. It has
Yeah.
estrogen activity. We have no idea. So I would say a great whey is fantastic. And then you asked me about collagen.
Wait, but before you,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, so whey, and then
Rice pea blends.
Is there, because whey, one thing that I've always known about whey is that it digests very fast.
But that's what you need.
That's what you need. So there's no problem with consuming whey in the middle of the day. Like, it's not just a post-workout tool.
No. In fact, when I did geriatrics, that was something that we always recommended.
Whey protein.
But, I will say that, and I will say that, I failed to mention this earlier, that when you exercise, your muscles are primed.
Right.
So essentially, you're getting more nutrient delivery. So you could actually, and I don't want to confuse anyone, but you could get away with less protein.
In the post-workout window?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But we're not going to recommend anyone do that, but it is a possibility.
Yeah. All right, so whey it is. Collagen.
Okay. Collagen is an incomplete protein. First of all, I love collagen, and I dose it pretty high in my practice, but not for a protein content. It has glycine, hydroxyproline. It has other higher levels of amino acids, but it's completely devoid of tryptophan and very low in branched chains. In fact, it's not considered a complete protein. It doesn't mean it doesn't have some effect. And I don't think that anyone knows the mechanism of action, which is interesting. And I've read quite a bit about this. It can stimulate growth factors. It's also great for hair, skin, and nails, which arguably, if you try it, anyone would say that's true, especially, I dose it at 2 scoops twice a day. But when you're looking at total caloric intake, you shouldn't even count it towards your protein.
Got it. So absolutely don't count the grams of collagen that you consume towards your 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight.
No. But you can count it towards calories. And there are some great benefits of collagen. Again, I use it all the time.
Use it all the time.
I do.
Hair, skin, nails, glycine, just for...
Anxiety helps with sleep.
Are you a believer in terms of glycine's capacity to boost metabolic health and for its longevity benefits and things like that? Chris Masterjohn talks a lot about that.
I think it's a possibility. I think that we don't have a lot of good human trials. And when I think about branched chain or when I think about amino acids in particular, there's that whole methionine restriction story. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of methionine restriction. It's one of the amino acids, and they use it in the fasting mimicking diet. They say you should restrict methionine, but all the studies are done in rats. And rats have a different methionine need. So there are just a lot of things that we need to think about. Is there good evidence for this? And I can't say, I think that in theory it could be amazing, but I just don't think we know enough.
We don't know enough.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. I use collagen as well.
How many scoops do you do?
I do 1 to 2, and I use it when I can sneak it into things that I'm consuming. So like soups, coffees,
Perfect.
Coffee drinks, things like that, smoothies. So I'm a fan. Well, we don't have that much time left. Is there anything else that that we want to talk about that I haven't brought up? I feel like we've covered so much.
I think that people in this time right now, we have more access to information than ever before. I think because of that, we have more access to confusion, and we have narratives that are pulling at our minds and pulling at our dollars. So I think finding good scientists that you trust is paramount, and I think asking the right questions, because the answers that you get are a reflection of the questions that you ask. So I think that that's just really important to understand, because when we ask the right questions, we can protect the people we love.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So
what do you see online that most angers you, like in terms of like nutritional misinformation?
So protein is obviously the number one, and it's for a very particular reason. So I have a 17-year education, which is gross.
That's amazing.
It's gross. But
I wish I had your background.
No,
you have a badass background.
But I've seen so much death. And this is the part, and this is why it's so important for me to get my message out there. And if your viewers are inspired, that they share. I have sat at the bedside of more people than I can count at their, deathbed. And that's part of being a geriatrician, is you're there when they leave life, right? The amount of falls, the amount of injuries, the amount of hip fractures that I have seen, because the focus has always been focus on obesity, focus on this, focus on the wrong thing, we could have prevented these injuries. We could have prevented the devastating effects of Alzheimer's. I mean, not all of it, right? There's some that are genetic and some that are beyond our control, but we have the duty to analyze the data, take people with experience, and protect the people we love, because, there's a lot of argument that happens when everyone's younger. In your 40s, I'm just going, no, be plant-based, be this, do this. That conversation changes dramatically when you can no longer stand, when someone you love falls and breaks a hip and they're never coming home. They're going into assisted living, which is like, you don't want to need assistance in living. It will debilitate you. So by changing the paradigm from this fat-focused paradigm to the real issue, which is muscle, we can protect the people we love. We can protect each other. Because there is a point in time where it's too late. And that's very powerful.
Yeah. I talk a lot about privilege and that it's this term that's thrown about today. It's almost become sort of like this weaponized thing. People use it to point fingers at one another and to create division. But I mean, you're so right that like adopting, these like vegan diets and just being so, and following the dietary advice of documentaries and things like that. Right. It's like, it really is a first world privilege, and primarily one of youth, I think. Because when you're older, when you're from another, from the third world, but other countries too, like, that are not necessarily third world. And when you're sick, none of this like bickering that we see all the time in the nutrition space like matters, At the end of the day, you want to do what's going to be right for your health. And I find that that's one of the things that motivates me, is helping people cut through the noise and get to like the truth. And that's why I'm so grateful for people like you who are like taking such a no nonsense approach about. And
I've been there. I'm not coming at it from a place where I haven't seen so much death that it makes me sick. It's not from this point of saying, oh, well, this is what I believe because I read this, or this is what I believe because of, just
because I've got a supplement line or whatever. Yeah.
It completely changes your perspective when you're working in a nursing home and you're seeing what they've eaten and you're taking their history and you're seeing this stuff. And I'm seeing online all this BS and all these people, listen, I get a lot of hate. For what? I guarantee you when you are that age, you're going to go, God, I was so dumb. And this was the advice I was giving my parents. Don't eat red meat because it's going to hurt you, or don't do that. It's the wrong advice. It's the single worst piece of advice we could ever give people. Don't eat your meat. Don't eat your protein. It's dangerous. It's deadly. So anyway,
no,
that's why I feel so passionate, because I've seen it. You tell me one other person that sat there, they would be saying the exact same thing I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it. One person.
You have.
But the most important person in my life.
I can't imagine.
And that person, my mom, she was a meat abstainer. She never ever, and I'm not being hyperbolic. She never ate red meat, and she never ate eggs. She occasionally would eat chicken, but very rarely, and occasionally would eat fish, but very, very rarely. And she tried to be, she was health conscious. Right. Like if you were to ask her, she was somebody for whom health mattered. And she was just abiding by the guidelines and abiding by the conventional wisdom.
And this is what we're hearing.
Yeah.
And so it's our duty to protect people from themselves by hopefully opening the lines of communication for education.
Boom. I love that. So true. So true. Needs to be heard and repeated. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
I've just got one last question for you, but before we get to that, where can listeners find you on social media?
Yes, they can find me on Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and that's Lyon, and my website. And I have a great free protocol that they can download. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk a lot about this stuff and the studies coming out and just information. So I'm sure you'll include some of the links, and a great newsletter where I highly curate the studies that I share.
And that's at your website?
It is.
Love that. Last question that gets asked to everybody on the show. What does it mean to you to live a genius life?
To be open to all information. and aware and discerning of the relevance of that information and take action based on that.
Beautiful. I agree. Well, thank you so much for your time, for being here. Did you drive up just for this, or were you?
I did.
Amazing. I love that. Thank you.
I expect a tie-dye sweatshirt.
I'm gonna get you a tie-dye. To all you guys out there, thank you so much for tuning in. Share this episode of the show. Share Dr. Lyon's work. Highlight your favorite quote. Tag myself. Tag her. Very much appreciate that. And text me to let me know what you thought about this episode of the show. I get them right here on my phone, 310-299-9401. And I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.